You all know me, know how I earn a living. This shark, swallow you whole. I value my neck a lot more than $3,000, Chief. Find him for 3, but I'll catch him and kill him for 10. $10,000 for me by myself. For that you get the head, the tail, the whole damn thing.
You yelled shark. We've got a panic on our hands on the 4th of July.
Mr. Vaughn, I pulled a tooth the size of a shot glass out of the wrecked hull of the boat out there, and it was the tooth of a great white.
A what?
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Love to prove that, wouldn't you? Get your name into the National Geographic.
No, I'm not saying that this is not the shark. It probably is, Martin. It probably is. It's a man-eater. It's extremely rare for these waters. But the fact is that the bite radius on this animal is different than the wounds on the victim.
Get out of that boat! Well, this is not a boat accident. There wasn't any propeller. There wasn't any coral reef. And it wasn't Jack the Ripper.
It was a shark.
I'll never put on a nice jacket again.
Welcome back to the Jaws Obsession, where we are here to share with you, prove to you, convince you, or remind you that Jaws is the greatest movie of all time. Yes, we are back here again. Thank you very much for lending your time out of your busy schedule to visit us and discuss the further events in the Jaws world according to the Jaws Obsession. We are here with episode 22, Switched on Jaws. The celebration continues regarding the Book of Quint, the announcement and the launching of the campaign to the Book of Quint on Indiegogo.com. As we go forward and the writing continues on with the Book of Quint, and we are now in the active campaign, and everyone can go visit the campaign site, or you can go to jawsob.com, bookofquint.com, where you can find links and go to the campaign site and catch up on the latest. We are at 25% of our funding goal. So going forward on the Jaws Obsession, I was kind of torn between, okay, how do I go about doing this? I don't want to make every episode into a commercial for the book, but yet I still want to talk about Jaws. As I'm coming down the back half of the Book of Quint, there's a lot of things being discovered that I've never realized. And I wanted to share that with you and bring you along on this process. I have reached an enjoyment of Jaws far more than I ever imagined when I started this process almost 2 years ago. So what I'm looking at now is I wanted to kind of share with you what I'm experiencing at the same time as I experience it. This is all happening in real time. And that's what I wanted to do going forward with the Jaws Obsession. We're still going to talk about Jaws and different little aspects of it. But now that there is so much more material that's opening up, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more next week. But this week, what I wanted to do was I wanted to bring you on in the process of how I approached the Book of Quint was I wanted to establish almost like I was making the movie. And in that, I wanted to share with you the music that I listen to while I write. One of the first things I did, even before I started the broadcast, was I produced this album because I wanted to set a tone before the writing phase started. It was kind of around the time of the writing phase started. And all the projects I have written for in the past, I've always wrote to music. It builds up a lot of visuals for me, and it creates the mood and the tone. And I knew that the Book of Quint would have to have its own feel for it to be realized. So what I wanted to do for this episode was I wanted to share with you and release this 5-track album that I produced with the great and ultra-talented Karl Casey, a very special composer and talented musical artist. Through corresponding, he lives in Vancouver, I'm here in New York. We corresponded long distance back and forth to create these tracks. The first question is why the title Switched on Jaws? Well, Switched on Jaws, it's a takeoff of the 1968 album Switched on Bach by Wendy Carlos, when the music of Bach was reimagined with the Moog synthesizer in 1968. It introduced a whole nother take on classical music through electronic composition. That's kind of what we did here with the music from Jaws. What Karl Casey did here was he took that and he composed and reworked some of the tracks through synthesizer. You have an entirely new feel and a new soundscape, but that creates a whole new feel for what I'm approaching the Book of Quint as. Quint is a tragic hero in my mind. The way I'm approaching it is that it's a haunting tale, because we all know how it ends, right? So we know that while you're watching or reading the book, and when you read the book, you're going to be watching the movie in your mind. And as you're doing that, the back end is tragic. There's a tragedy on the back end. So there is almost a ghost story feel to it, a haunting feel to the whole layout. And that's where I was approaching when I wanted to have some music produced. I wanted to have it in the same tradition of some of the music, some of my favorite soundtracks from when I was growing up. I listened to a lot of soundtracks growing up. So the music of Tangerine Dream, John Carpenter, and Maurice Jarre, who was the composer for a lot of Peter Weir films. So the Book of Quint will be kind of it's a very haunting tale, almost a ghost story. I wanted to work with a composer that creates music in the same tradition. So early on, I kept playing the soundtrack to The Fog or Witness, 1985 Witness with Harrison Ford. That soundtrack is composed by Maurice Jarre. The Fog is composed by John Carpenter. But when it comes down to just zeroing in and getting myself into the Jaws feeling for the Book of Quint, there has to be sort of a bridge. And I needed to have that to be able to envision this raw world, this pre-tourist world of Amity Island. That's what we're kind of creating here. When you listen to Switched on Jaws, you're having a different feel, but you're still very familiar with a lot of the melodies and a lot of the arrangements. And that's what's kind of neat about this, is that through the music, you're revisiting Jaws, but through a different lens. It's the same approach that we've taken the Jaws obsession, where you watch Jaws, but you watch it through a different lens. You revisit Jaws knowing different information, and therefore you enjoy it in a different way. And your mind is opened up more. And that's what I have been doing as I have lived with this story in my head and reworked it. And as I have researched it, it's now going to be 2 years now. And as far as the writing phase, it's been over 6 months, well over 6 months of writing so far, that I actually develop a better understanding with every chapter that I work on. I have a better understanding of the character of Quint, but also the movie of Jaws. I appreciate it more, and I see things differently happening in that movie. And it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And I wanted to kind of share that with you and take you along on this process. So really quick, how did I come in contact with Karl Casey? Karl Casey has a extensive presence on YouTube and Bandcamp. These are the sites that he uses to host a lot of his music. So you'll find links in the description of this broadcast. Karl Casey's YouTube page is Bandcamp, and White Bat Audio, which is his website, where you can actually go and experience some of the music that he does. And that's how I got in touch with him, and back and forth we went. And the first thing that we had to create was we had to create a theme for the show. He would throw sketches at me, like musical sketches, and then I would listen to them, and I would put them, maybe say, can you do this? I really like this part, but this part, can you put these two parts together? And it kind of grew from there. The first track of Switched on Jaws is actually the theme song that we are all very familiar now to the Jaws obsession. And the opening theme is actually an instrumental, but I added in the Jaws lines, and I actually threw in there's actually elements of some of the compositions from the Jaws soundtrack in there as well, playing underneath Karl's music. the instrumental version of that without the Jaws lines, it never clears YouTube's censors. So YouTube always says it's copyright claim on it. The Jaws lines kind of hide those mask the censors from finding the John Williams tracks. And what happens is that we are allowed to play that on YouTube. So that's why we won't be listening to the instrumental. But if you go to episode 8 of the Jaws Obsession, the Mystery of the Brody Shoulder Towel, at the end of that, I actually included an instrumental version of the Jaws Obsession opening, which is track 1 of Switched on Jaws. The first thing I noticed, this was the first track that we worked on, and the first track that, when he sent me the final version, that second part, what I really liked about that was I said, this is the tone. That's the tone right there. Not just for the Jaws Obsession, but I was saying that's the tone for the book. That's what I kind of wanted to zero in on. We're going to listen to now is the Farewell and Adieu track, and that's what everyone heard. I used an element of that for the trailer for the Book of Quint. And when Karl wrote that and he put it together and you have a lot of those dark synths playing behind it, that's when the book kind of came to life right there. I saw the trailer, I saw everything right there, and it was unbelievable. It's when you listen to this track, the Farewell and Adieu, you are now in Quint's world. So we are separating ourselves from the Jaws world, but we're still, so we are not, it's not, how should I say this? Jaws has always had a problem in that everything that was done in the Jaws universe was always a derivative of that first one. So when you take a photocopy, when you take a picture and you make a photocopy of it, that copy is not going to be as crisp as the original. And then when you copy the second one, it's going to be weaker and have more flaws. And then if you take a copy of that third copy, you're going to have even more weaker flaws, and you're going to have more mistakes. And it's going to be so far different from the original, it's just not going to. So what happens is that when you want to do something that's new to the Jaws world, what you cannot do is you cannot try to do a derivative of number one. What you have to do is you have to establish, you have to use elements that are in that everybody knows and is familiar with number one, but you have to make it your own. And that's what this track, Farewell and Adieu, does, is that it sets a whole new tone for the Book of Quint, that if there were to be a movie, or if this would go any further, that this would be the recipe for success, in that you're not trying to be Jaws, you're adding on to the story of Jaws, using your own story. And that's what's so cool about Farewell and Adieu. So when you listen to this, this is the tone, this is that haunting sea story type of tone that the Book of Quint will have. Remember, this is a tragic tale, and Quint is the ultimate anti-hero. And that was Farewell and Adieu by Karl Casey off Switched on Jaws. I also want everybody to know that on our YouTube page over at Jaws Obsession, Switched on Jaws is also going to be posted on YouTube in its entirety. So you can play this whole mini album here as part of the celebration for the Book of Quint. So you'll be able to follow the links in the description below, and you can listen to the entire album on its own without me talking between the tracks. So moving on, we have the next track would be, this was the one that when Karl sent me this I didn't even have any input on. He kind of sent me this one and he just said, what do you think about this? And I was blown away. You know, this is where Karl started taking me for a ride. That's where I believe that I was watching a master at work. Here I was, again, watching something being created out of nothing, something fresh, something new. The newer generations, for them to appreciate Jaws, you cannot rehash old stuff that was in the past. What you have to do is you have to give a fresh feel to it, but you can still be true to the source material. It's just that when he sent me this track, it was even more validation that this project was meant to be, that the Book of Quint was meant to be, the Jaws Obsession. This had to be done. So all these long nights and all this missed time and time away from the family and all of the research and everything that goes into writing a book and writing a novel, there was validation when I heard this next track. So let's get to it. Track title, Orca. And that was Orca by Karl Casey off of Switched on Jaws. What's interesting about that track, and it leads us into the next track, Karl uses a musical device, if that's what it's called. I am not a musician, so I do not pretend to be a musician. So if my technical terms are a little off here, please bear with me. However, I named this album Switched on Jaws because I explained earlier it's a takeoff of the 1968 album Switched on Bach. Well, Johann Sebastian Bach used he was considered the king of the fugue. The fugue is it's that style of composition where there is a subject and then there is an answer. So John Williams, throughout the entire soundtrack to Jaws, he uses a fugue in many different areas of the soundtrack where there's a subject and then there's an answer. The answer is always in a different key. So you would have that da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, where you play a theme and then you have an answer in a different key. This is also used in many other successful composers, and a great effect on me was John Carpenter. John Carpenter uses this in the Halloween theme, the theme to The Fog. If you look at the soundtrack for The Fog, there's the subject and then there's an answer in a different key, and he repeats that over and over again. So John Williams actually had a track off the soundtrack called the Shark Cage Fugue. And the Shark Cage Fugue was when our three heroes are building the shark cage. So in the Shark Cage Fugue, you have a lot of subjects and the answers, and that's what John Williams used. And it's that montage sequence of building the shark cage that I really like. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to see Karl's take on that. So I actually I said, Karl, if you could please, because I knew we needed 5 tracks. So I said, for the next track, if you could do your take on the Shark Cage Fugue, because I think that you're going to really knock this out of the park. When I'm writing the Book of Quint, a lot of those sequences where Quint is working and rebuilding his boat into what it becomes, the Orca. There's also, he's inventing things like the harpoon gun, the harpoon firing rifle. That's a Quint invention. And there's a reason why he has to invent that. So that's all in there. So what I do is I kind of am imagining our hero Quint, played by Ian Shaw, and I'm imagining these montage sequences, and there would be this Shark Cage Fugue playing. So I asked Karl to do his take on the Shark Cage Fugue, and I said, this is a chance to let everybody really know who Karl Casey is. Now, Karl has an extensive background in all sorts of instruments, guitars, and I asked him to really let it rip, something that I almost could go jogging to. He came back with this, and I was blown away. So I was very, very happy with this. He came back with this. I said, that's it. That's unbelievable. There was because usually the process was he would send me a track, and I would make some notes and send it back to him, and then he would make some changes. When he sent it to me, there was that middle part where I just said, hey, just amp it up there and let it rip, and let's get some energy into this. And he said, okay, here you go. And what we have the next track called Shark Cage Fugue. And that was the track Shark Cage Fugue off of Switched on Jaws. Now, see, that ending right there just shows you the massive skill and intelligence of Mr. Karl Casey, where you have an intense driving track, and then he just dives right into that Orca theme that makes the track so much more intelligent. And that little section, that little theme right there, I used in the trailer for the Book of Quint, because those are just little moments of brilliance that you have to just cherish. It's those little things like that that make that so special, and that's why I was so proud of Switched on Jaws. If anything, we have the broadcast Jaws obsession, but we have this magnificent little gem called Switched on Jaws that was gifted to us by Mr. Karl Casey. And we all should thank him for that, because it's fresh new material to the Jaws universe. And it's intelligent, and there's a lot of layering going on. And that's kind of the theme for the movie of Jaws, is that there's a lot of layers going on. We establish those layers, and we go into those layers, not just in the Jaws obsession, but the Book of Quint really brings up a whole other set of layers. The next track, as the fifth track, he actually wanted to do this. He said, I would really like to do the end titles, the end title track to Jaws. And I said, absolutely. I said that I was standing out of the way of Karl. I said, I don't even want it. You're on your own, man. Everything you're sending over is unbelievable. So go ahead. He comes back with this quote unquote sketch, and that was it. I'm a huge fan of Peter Weir films. What do you have? Witness, Dead Poets Society, Master and Commander. I could go on and on. The composer that he worked with in the 80s was a man named Maurice Jarre. Maurice Jarre did a lot of different movies, from Dr. Zhivago all the way up into the 80s. And he started to use synthesizer orchestration. Instead of using an actual orchestra, he would actually use a synthesizer and layer on those synthesizers to make an orchestra sound. So if you listen to some of his soundtracks, they can be very deep and they can be very sweeping and moving using an electronic score. And that's where Karl came in with this end titles. And I immediately thought of Maurice Jarre. That's how, and I would not be saying this just to be nice. I take these things very seriously. When I heard this end titles track, I'd almost have to say I got a little emotional, because it's not only is it so beautiful, but there's a lot of heartbreak and emotion in the backstory to Quint. And the end titles track was always very bittersweet in Jaws, because we're happy that Hooper and Brody survived, but we're sad for Quint. And when you come to the realization that Quint was living in a lot of pain, not just physical, but emotional, I think what a lot of people will realize when you read the Book of Quint is that there is a awareness aspect to a post-traumatic stress disorder and survivor's guilt from being in traumatic situations. In many ways, Quint was released from this pain that he was suffering, not just internally, but also physically on his body. When you think of that part of the character, part of the story of Jaws, and you listen to this end titles, it's bittersweet. You're happy that Hooper and Brody survived, and maybe you wanted Quint to survive, but he's also in a better place. And that was very, very apparent when I heard this track by Karl. So I wanted to share that with you, and I'm glad I can share that with you. This is how we're going to end the show. We're going to end the show with this track. We're not going to have the Show Me the Way to Go Home song. This is perfect. It's the end titles to Jaws, and now it's Karl Casey's rendition of that. Just remember, everybody can go to jawsob.com, bookofquint.com, and catch up with the details on the campaign. You can send an email at jawsob2025@gmail.com. Follow the links on the description to this broadcast on whatever platform you're listening on. And you can actually go hear this entire EP together. When you hear it all put together, right over on our YouTube page, the Switched on Jaws EP is posted there. It only plays for 13 minutes, but it's 13 minutes where you actually connect. Just listen to all the tracks strung together, and you actually can see the Book of Quint and the story of Quint materializing before your eyes. So please be sure to visit the YouTube video. You can like and subscribe to our page, leave reviews, and let us know what you think to Switched on Jaws or the Book of Quint. With that, I'd like to bid everyone farewell and adieu, and I'll see you next week. And here we're going to close with the end titles to Switched on Jaws by Karl Casey.